Hello and welcome to another conversation with the Middle East Monitor. My name is Naseem Ahmed, and thank you for joining us on another MEMO conversation, the show that brings you weekly updates and conversations on the pressing issues in the Middle East. This week, we have another book review called Camera Palestine, Photography and Displaced Histories of Palestine. I'm fortunate to have the three authors in front of me, and I will be speaking to them about their book. Professor Stephen Sheehi, he's an American Middle East Studies scholar of Lebanese origin. He is a professor of Arabic studies at the Sultan Qaboos bin Said Chair of Middle East Studies at the College of William and Mary. Professor Sheehi last week was one of the winners at the Palestine Book Awards for a different book, but not this book. And I also have Professor Salim Tamari. He is a Palestinian sociologist who is the director of the Institute of Palestine Studies and an adjunct professor at the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies at Georgetown University. And also the third author, Professor Issam Nassar. He is a Palestinian historian of photography in Palestine and Middle East, professor of history at Illinois State University, and a research fellow at the Institute of Palestine Studies. Thank you all for joining me. It's a real pleasure to have you on the show. And we're having this conversation under the dark cloud of a massacre in Gaza. Before we really dive into your book, I just want to get your thoughts on the situation in Gaza and the fact that, there's destruction and death that's been rained down on the besieged Palestinian population there. So if I could start with you, Stephen, first of all, just to give me your feelings and thoughts before we get into the conversation.
Well, thank you for having us, Naseem. It's really an honor. And I know also Salim, I believe, had won a Palestine Book Award too a couple of years back. So it's nice to sort of make a full circle here. I'm the only non-Palestinian among the authors, so I'm going to not be belabored points that can be made by Issam and Salim far better. I think what I just want to sort of import into the analysis is that what we are witnessing is really, I think, the fact that we're on the edge, potentially right now, and it's October 12th, on the verge of a regional war that the United States is excitedly seems to be running into. And we can see that these are the consequences of what happens when colonized people take history into their own hands, that it often provides excuses for genocidal settler colonial regimes to carry out plans that they the imperial masters like the United States. So I just want to put that larger sort of forward-looking, like where we are going. And I just want to make sure also to know that this is also going to we should also be people have been talking this being the 9/11 for the state now known as Israel. It might have been, even though I think it's far more important for Palestinian people to see that this is a moment of liberation for them. But what this moment does have in common with 9/11 is that there are going to be pogroms against Palestinians inside the state now known as Israel, in Jerusalem and in the West Bank, but also in Europe and North America. I can guarantee you we've already seen the increase attacks on Muslim and Muslim adjacent and Muslim Americans and Europeans. And it's going to be, these are going to be dark days ahead of us, as they were in 9/11, where, you're going to have unbridled Islamophobia and Arab sentiments unleashed against the populations of North America and Europe.
But Stephen, your connection isn't very clear. So if your connection isn't very clear, maybe move to a different part of the room, maybe a bit stronger. But can I ask Issam and Salim, you are both Palestinians. Do you have relatives in Gaza? And just give us your thoughts about what's happening in Gaza right now. Salim, let's start with you.
Well, we have, in my case, I have friends in Gaza. I don't have any relatives, but Gaza is in for a long haul, as are all of us. And we have seen this scene before over and over again. At the end of the day, Israel will have to confront what comes next, which is, in this case, perhaps regional, come together to examine the long-suffering besieged region of Gaza and its relationship to the rest of Palestine, and of course the issue of Palestinian self-determination. So in the midst of this catastrophe, immense suffering of people and constant bombardment, we should look for the way ahead, and it might actually hasten an international consensus on the necessity for quick intervention to deal not only with the besiegement of Gaza, but also with the whole Palestinian issue. And perhaps it will bring faster the end of the apartheid regime in Israel. But in the meantime, I think we're going to see a lot of suffering before any political move takes place.
Yeah, I agree. I think that is the case, but let's hope that there is a swift intervention by somebody. We were quite shocked here in the UK yesterday when the leader of the Labour Party, Keir Starmer, basically gave the green light for the Israelis to cut off electricity, cut off water, and basically a green light to carry out war crimes. So it was quite shocking, and there's been a backlash to that. But the number of Western leaders who are standing on the sideline and almost cheering Israel on, it's quite shocking and revolting. But yeah, let's see how that develops. Issam, do you want to comment on what's happening in Gaza?
Yeah, I agree with what my friends, two friends said before. It is, there are several ways in which this could go, and we don't know. But for sure, the days ahead of us are going to be dark in terms of massacres in Gaza, and we fear that they will not be limited to Gaza, that under the guise of war, settler violence in the West Bank might increase, and settlers might take the lead in attacking villages. It already started, but it could be very, very dangerous somehow, and possibly lead to some sort of further ethnic cleansing. So our hearts are with the people of Gaza, with the people of Palestine in general, and with the possible victims in the West right now, in Europe and the United States.
Thank you for your somber reflections on that. Let's turn to your book. The book, as I mentioned, is about Wasif Jawhariyyeh and his 7 photography albums entitled The Illustrated History of Palestine. And the 3 of you took a deep dive into the book. So let's begin with the collaboration itself. How did that come together, Stephen? Let's start with that. How did your collaboration for the book come together? And unmute yourself, please.
Thank you. I hope the collection is better. You know, the history, I think, of the collaboration comes from both professional and personal relationships. At one level, you know, Salim and Issam are, I would say, the foremost, and I think everyone would say, the foremost scholars of Wasif Jawhariyyeh. They've edited his autobiography, both in Arabic and then had it translated into English. And that autobiography or memoirs are a really, really important source for the Mandate period, the between the war period in Palestine. And so, you know, these two are are, you know, the Jawhariyyeh scholars. And I had, like many of us, dabbled in the albums, done some work for one of my past books. In the process, you know, I was friends with Issam and, of course, acquaintances with Salim. But because of Issam's scholarship on photography, we were able to sort of close the loop more, and our relationship got tighter over our shared interest in Wasif Jawhariyyeh, and we started to collaborate. So it was a nice synchronicity.
That's great. So yeah, great to have two of the foremost experts on Jawhariyyeh here. So let's talk about Jawhariyyeh slightly. Salim, what can you tell us about Wasif Jawhariyyeh and his collection? Why is he so important and significant in this study?
Wasif Jawhariyyeh was a musician who lived at the end of the Ottoman era and the beginning of the Mandate. And his work is important, I believe, because he wrote a very vivid ethnographic memoir of the cultural history of Jerusalem and Palestine in the first half of the 20th century. His importance can be underlined by a selection made by the Guardian newspaper, where his work has been described as one of 10 great witnesses of the 20th century. And I think we did not put this in the cover of our book. We should have done, but it gives you an idea how much this unknown figure, he was unknown because his musical career was not outstanding. He was more important as a cultural participant in events which showed the great changes that took place with the coming of the First World War, the end of the Ottomans, the beginning of the Mandate, and the transformation of the city of Jerusalem from one which was in which all the ethnic communities lived in it to one in which the British invited the Balfour Declaration to create a Jewish national home and all the national catastrophes that took place after that. He does not emphasize the political events, although these are watershed sources in the background, but rather on the tempo of daily life, on the celebrations, the ceremonials, the social get-togethering, the educational nahda that was taking place in Jerusalem and Palestine at the time. And he does this uniquely in a way in which combines photographic images that he collected with a musical notebook and his memoirs of daily life. So in short, that is the significance of Jawhariyyeh. We tried to enhance his work through editing his memoirs in 2 volumes and this photographic collection called Camera Palaestina, which covers 6 essays on various facets on how the photography sheds light on the great happenings of Jerusalem and Palestine in the 20th century.
That's a great summary. Issam, if I can turn to you. So Sally mentioned the photography, the albums, which, if I'm not mistaken, includes probably 7,000 photos, if I can remember correctly. And it stretches between the Ottoman period, the British Mandate, the Israeli occupation. So a long stretch of time, huge fluxes and changes within Palestine. So what do we learn from his album about Palestinian life, the 3 major shifts which he saw in his time that we didn't know, and what does it tell us about Jawhariyyeh himself transitioning through these huge upheavals in Palestine?
Thank you. Actually, the albums contain only 900 pictures that he did not take himself, but collected from various photographers and people who gifted him the photographs. The collection focuses on two periods. First, the Ottoman period in Jerusalem, and with a particular focus on Jerusalem, though occasionally there are sections that are not particularly from Jerusalem, but from the Ottoman front on the Dead Sea and in other locations. And the second focus is the British Mandate period in Palestine. The photographs tell us a lot individually. Each one of them, of course, has its own story, enhanced by commentary that Wasif provided in his notebook that accompanied the albums, as well as in his captions that he placed under each photograph. And of course, the memoirs enhance that, because often in the memoirs he refers to a particular picture in there. But what's also important is his putting together the albums as if they are a particular narrative in time. He divided the albums into different periods. And each period tells us takes us more or less visually into the, shall we call it worldview or the atmosphere of that time period. So what we get from album one, for example, is we get a great illustration of the social classes, particularly the nobility, the clergy, the administrators in Jerusalem. So we get a feeling of what the life of the, let's call it the milieu in Jerusalem at the time looked like. And we then move into different events, social events, musical gatherings, the effects of the Great War or World War I on the lives of the people at the time. And then we move into the British occupation of Palestine, where he also, rather than he deal with specific disasters or what happened and how bad or great that was, which somehow is in his memoir. Here we move into the new administration, the new relations in society. We get to see in both Ottoman and British periods, colonial period, we get to feel the vibe of Palestine and the city as a place where the cultural scene is rather happening. We see the visits of great musicians. We see scenes from the Sharia court, for example. We see scenes of daily life, of even demonstrations by women against the Balfour Declaration and during the 1929 riots in Palestine. So we get the feeling, generally speaking, he takes us into a journey, a historical imaginary journey of his time period, which gives us a view that is different from the typical view of the Palestinian peasantry, the Zionist settlements, the Nakba. I mean, some elements of that are in there. But generally speaking, we get to see how society was diverse, was active in variety of ways. And I think that's an important element in the collection itself.
So presumably there's three authors and you would have all three approached the book in three different ways, Stephen. So what are the three different perspectives you bring to the study and analysis of the albums, Stephen?
Wow, it's a great question. I think this is one thing that made the project exciting, that, both Salim, Issam, and I are interested in, Jawhariyyeh. We all have history with dealing with photography in the Arab world, and dealing with indigenously produced photography in the Arab world, and dealing with Palestinian photography. So the question is, again, sort of like, how we sort of share the same interests, but how do we actually, as three different people, I consider myself a cultural theorist, maybe a cultural historian. I think Issam is definitely a cultural historian, and Salim is a sociologist or sociological history. And so each one of us does a sort of a social history of Jerusalem itself and of the life of Jawhariyyeh. And this is actually what Salim does. And then Issam talks about the history of sort of this photographic oeuvre in the moment of the mandate. And I think I just try to think a little more theoretically about how photography acts as a vehicle, let's say, of storytelling and story making. So, my own piece, and I'll let Issam and Salim speak to their pieces specifically, but, what I was trying to think about, or what I think is important about Wasif Jawhariyyeh's oeuvre, is that he allows us to think about what happens when you're the colonized person, and all you are left with is an archive of images taken by the colonizer, effectively, right? Taken by people by Orientalists. And it's really a matter of what Jawhariyyeh does with this oeuvre, and he actually reappropriates all of this Orientalist images, all these postcards, all these images taken by expatriate photographers, some Palestinian photographers, but also a large amount which weren't. And how is he narrating what he's seeing as an emergent Palestinian, I would say, Palestinian national identity. And the other part of that is that sort of, in the process, the Palestinian archive, the sort of Orientalist archive, it becomes reappropriated, it becomes animated with Palestinian life, right? What's special about Jawhariyyeh, he kind of is able to corral rather often banal pictures, and actually infuse them with particular sort of excitement, because he can identify who are in these otherwise generic pictures, right? We see a generic picture of, the generic picture of the stonecutter, for example, on the front cover. He knew these people. He knew what church was being built. He knew who was paying those guys, right? He knew all those workers, right? So here he is, he's enlivening, and he's really acting out, al-awda, the return of the Palestinian into the Palestinian photographic archive, even before the Nakba happened. So that was what kind of interested me, and why I found his oeuvre so important. And I think Salim and Issam can speak better to their.
So Salim, of course, you are two foremost experts on this, and you're professors in other areas as well. So what particular aspect do you come with in analyzing Jawhariyyeh's album?
I want to speak about the concept of animation, which Stefan has just introduced. Jawhariyyeh was a great collector of portraits of friends, commanders, colleagues, and musicians. And the interpretation of the social history of Jerusalem through portraits is one theme that I have examined in this book. There are two portraits, one given to him by Ali Roshan Beg, who was the commander, the Ottoman Albanian commander of the Jerusalem garrison, and he talks a lot about the Ottoman governance of the city during the war. And the other one is a picture of the mayor of Jerusalem, Hussein Hashim al-Husseini, with whom he had a kind of patronage relationship. He was a client of the Husseinis, and he was a long time a benefactor of their largesse. But his biographical work on Hussein is so interesting, because this man was known for the surrender of Jerusalem to the British on December 9th, 1917. But beyond this dramatic moment of surrender, which is also examined in a number of photographs in this book, he talks about his relationship with the Husseinis, who were the patrons of the Awqaf, of the mayoralty of the city. And through them, we see a very tragic history of how this great man of aristocratic family from Jerusalem became the instrument of the surrender and fall of the city. And through this, we examine a number of photographs and see how we can deconstruct them in order to see what was happening behind the scenes. So we give the official version of the surrender, then we go through how the photograph reveals a number of intricacies that were taking place about Ottoman withdrawal, the chaos that happened in the city, the attempt to salvage the city from the retreating army, and to maintain its running functions through these series of portraits that I have examined. The other portrait that I dealt with is spectacle, which is how Jawhariyyeh saw the evolution of a local theater from the magic box, which is called Sanduq al-Sihri in Arabic, to the instrument known as shadow play, which is a puppet theater. And that is explained in a number of series where the texts of the plays given in the shadow play theater, known in Turkish as karakos, as well as in Arabic, have been censored by the local authorities because of the subversive nature of these performances. And Jawhariyyeh has preserved a number of these censored texts for us to see the kind of cultural struggle that was taking place in Palestine, as well as in greater Syria, in Lebanon, and in Syria itself and Iraq at the period. So these are small vignettes which animate, as Stefan mentioned, animate the text with through the series of photographs.
And Issam, unmute yourself a second.
Yeah. The section I wrote about, or my chapter, dealt with also similar ideas, but from a rather different perspective, I suppose, or disciplinary perspective. I was intrigued by the fact that Jawhariyyeh told us a story, narrated a history through photographs. And in the process, he created an archive, photographic archive. True, the pictures are available elsewhere, but in this particular case, he put them together. To find each picture, we have to go to various places to dig for the image of the governor of Jerusalem or whoever. But this is so valuable that we have now a list, for example, of images of all the mayors of Jerusalem until his time. And the same with the governors of Jerusalem, etc. So I looked into the collection of the albums as an archive primarily, and questioned the role of Jawhariyyeh as the archive keeper, as the keeper of the archivist who decides what's worth putting in this archive and what's not. The other element I was interested in is Jawhariyyeh himself. Here is a regular man, shall we call him, a nobody in the general scene. Not a leader, not a renowned figure, and he collects images in which he is not in them, but he managed somehow to place himself in the center of each image by telling us anecdotes about what he was doing at that time or about the people who appeared in the picture. So somehow this general history of Palestine is also the story of what Jawhariyyeh wants us to think about himself, which is interesting, not only just because, you know, here's a man who put himself in the middle of history, but he's also telling us how we should think about himself, him, and about his society at the time. So he clearly reflects the values, the views, the discussions, and the aspirations of the time in that way. And that was kind of the main focus of my contribution, I would say.
So I want to end with a final question to all three of you. This is to all three of you. How this book, the albums, the photos can play a part in resistance. As we know, if the project is erasure, remembrance itself is resistance. And literature like this, books such as Jawhariyyeh's, helps us to remember Palestine and preserve the memory of Palestine. So how in each case, how do you think Jawhariyyeh's work can help the current generation who are still in the midst of huge pain and suffering and resisting Israeli occupation? How can we use his work to help resist Israeli occupation, push back against decolonization, and challenge Zionist claims about Palestine? I know it's a big question, but let's start with Stephen, and we'll end with each one of your response to that.
Thank you so much. Okay. Thank you so much for that. I mean, obviously, that is actually the question of the day, right? Literally of the day. And all of our work, I think, on Palestine has to do somehow with disrupting settler futures and ensuring Palestinian liberation. So I think how I approach the work and how I think the work our book in fact together is important is because what I think it does is there's a parallel, for example, right? That is, if we look at the images of Palestine, we can say the problem is not to say that whether Palestinians are or are not there, or were or were not there. Any Zionist knows that. They all know that, right? The fact of it is, are they still there? And when we think about settler colonialism, it's not about talking about the colonized or the indigenous population in past tense. That's convenient. We can do that, right? What we are talking about is Palestinians in the future tense and in the present tense. And in looking at these images taken by colonizers and showing that even in those pictures that we are taught to see them as lost figures of history, or anonymous figures, or Arab, not even Palestinians half the time, right? As sort of these ghostly shadows in this city of Jerusalem that once was Palestinian or once was Arab. What happens is when it teaches us, and Jawhariyyeh teaches us, and I think this book teaches us, to look at Palestinian images and to see the Palestinians looking back at us. Those Palestinians who are still alive in Palestinian life and society. These images, as Issam and Salim were saying, and all of our three work, I think, focuses on the fact that the Jawhariyyeh archive animates and shows a social network, a living social network within Palestine. And that, they have conflicts and they have tensions and they have intrigues, and that's what makes it fun, right? But it is something called a Palestinian polity. And when we look at those images and we look at those people are looking back at us. And who are they looking back at? They are looking back at their ancestors who are alive today, Palestinians who are alive, living under occupation, and in fact, some of them of which are fighting back, right? So maybe we can think about this book as a portal to the way in which Palestinians are fighting back through the visual archive.
Salim.
I really don't want to overload the function of this book. Resistance is a very strong term that we may not have the honor to represent in this book, but it does, it's an essay on cultural history. And as such, it's an interpretive essay on the deconstruction of many photographers, as it is linked to Jawhariyyeh's text of what was happening in Jerusalem and in Palestine in the first half of the 20th century. So it is mainly, in my view, a work of de-orientalizing Palestine, and therefore presenting a kind of native vision of events, of culture, of daily life that is seen beyond the official history that was taking place. If you want to call this resistance, I think it may be correct, but it overloads the way in which this book is presented. But let it be at that. Thank you.
Good point. Issam.
Well, yeah, I agree with Salim and with Stefan partly. I think when we think nowadays of Jerusalem and all the debates about Jerusalem, here we have Al-Aqsa storm, and we have this and that. We have the Zionist narrative about Jerusalem's Jewish history, etc. We get the feeling that this is a conflict. We live in a conflict right now between religions. So we keep the Jerusalemite outside of the picture. Jawhariyyeh's images place the Jerusalemite inside, back into his city as an active participant, as an agent, gave him agency in the life of the city and Palestine in general. And I think this way it's a reminder somehow that it is people that matter. A city is nothing if it's not about its people, their connections, their social relations, their hate, their love, their engagements, etc., etc. So I think if we have to give the book a kind of make it part of a struggle, it simply places the Palestinian back in the middle of his own or her own history in that sense.
Thank you so much for that. I mean, just commenting on that before we finish. I think in some ways, look, when narrative is weaponized, it's inevitable. Books will become parts of resistance. That's just how I look at things. And the way you presented Jawhariyyeh, I think it gives a vision of what Palestine was. If we know what Palestine was, we can recreate that Palestine where Jews, Christians, Muslims, so many other different minority communities can live in the same territory, same land, without being oppressed, without being subjugated. And if there's a model of that, which is presented through that book, then that's a model that's worth preserving for the future. So in that sense, yes, it's just a book, which is rightly so, but it's also a way for Palestinians to reimagine what Palestine could be and what we can achieve in the future, which is that all the faith communities and the various groups can live together as they did before Israel's Zionist occupation. I think that I wanted to, unless you want to come back on that, I think it's probably worth ending on that note. I want to just thank the three of you for joining me, and hope to see everyone soon again in another conversation with the Middle East Monitor. Bye-bye.